Welcome to What the Comp, the Pay Strategy Podcast, where compensation stops being confusing and starts making sense for real organizations. I'm Jennifer Loftus, National Director at Astron Solutions, and today we're talking about one of the biggest tensions inside organizations, the relationship between human resources and finance when it comes to compensation. Because compensation doesn't sit cleanly in one world. It sits between people and money. And when those two perspectives aren't aligned, organizations feel it everywhere. Here's the truth. Most compensation problems aren't actually compensation problems. They're alignment problems. Specifically, alignment between human resources and finance.
Because human resources often approaches compensation through the lens of attraction, retention, equity, motivation, engagement, and employee experience.
And finance approaches compensation through the lens of cost, forecasting, control, savings, sustainability.
And both perspectives matter. The problem is, most organizations operate as if one side owns compensation more than the other, usually human resources. But compensation impacts almost every financial decision an organization makes. Product and service pricing, potential shareholder dividends, business expansion and contraction activities, mergers and acquisitions viability. And when finance feels disconnected from compensation strategy, or human resources feels blocked by budget conversations, that's where the friction starts. And if you're in human resources, you've probably experienced this. You're trying to solve
turnover, job vacancies, pay compression, and market competitiveness.
And finance responds with,
what's the cost? What's the return on investment? Can we even sustain this?
And that can feel frustrating.
Like compensation is being reduced to a spreadsheet. But if you're in finance, you're probably experiencing something different.
You're looking at labor cost rising, forecast uncertainty, budget pressure, inflation, board demands. And compensation requests you can feel are endless. Annual raises, ad hoc adjustments, exceptions, retention increases, market corrections.
And from that perspective, it can feel like there's no structure. So both sides become frustrated. HR thinks finance doesn't understand people. Finance thinks HR doesn't understand financial reality. And the organization gets stuck in the middle. So why does this tension show up so consistently? There are a few patterns we see over and over again. The first issue, human resources and finance often define success differently. HR is focused on outcomes like
engagement, retention, internal equity, manager effectiveness, and finance is focused on
predictability, margin, cost management, long-term sustainability.
Neither side is wrong, but if those goals aren't connected, compensation decisions become reactive. Because what happens in many organizations is HR brings forward a compensation concern, and finance evaluates it strictly as cost, not strategy. So the conversation immediately narrows. Instead of asking,
what outcome are we trying to create? The discussion becomes, how much will this cost?
And that changes the entire dynamic. The second issue, compensation is often organizationally positioned as a human resources function. But financially, it's one of the most important strategic levers an organization has. For many organizations, employee compensation is the single largest expense. Not technology, not facilities, not operations, people. And yet compensation discussions are still sometimes treated like tactical HR conversations instead of enterprise strategy conversation. That disconnect creates tension because finance wants structure and predictability, while human resources often responds to real-time talent pressures. So what happens? Organizations create exceptions, one-off adjustments, retention increases, urgent offers, and eventually the compensation structure starts drifting away from the financial strategy. The third issue, HR and finance often communicate compensation differently. HR tends to frame compensation through people impact. Finance tends to frame it through budgetary impact. Without translation between those two perspectives, the conversation breaks down. For example, HR may say,
"We need to increase pay to improve retention," but finance hears,
"We need to spend more money."
But the real conversation should be, what is turnover currently costing us? What's the financial impact of replacement? What happens if we don't address this? That's the bridge. And many organizations never build it. The fourth pattern, organizations become reactive. A hiring challenge happens, a key employee threatens to leave. Market pressure increases, and compensation decisions start happening quickly, without alignment, without structure, without shared evaluation. And in the moment, those decisions often feel justified. But over time, they create inconsistency, budget strain, internal equity problems, manager confusion, employee disengagement, and eventually, trust issues. Here's the key point. Compensation works best when HR and finance stop treating each other like opposing forces and start operating as strategic partners. So what do you do? Because this tension doesn't disappear on its own. And as long as it exists, the harder compensation becomes to manage consistently. Starting Monday, begin defining success jointly. Not human resources success, not finance success, organizational success. What outcomes matter most? Retention, predictability, growth, internal equity, performance. Because if each side is solving for different outcomes, you'll never get alignment. Starting Monday, begin translating compensation discussions into business outcomes, not just salary increases or turnover costs, hiring delays, productivity impact, replacement expense. People analytics identifying bottom line impacts and best paths forward. Because compensation decisions are never just about payroll. They affect the entire organization. Starting Monday, begin creating shared frameworks for compensation decisions. What justifies an exception? When should adjustments happen? How do you evaluate retention risk? Because without structure, every situation feels subjective. Starting Monday, begin identifying where compensation decisions repeatedly go outside the system. When and where do those exceptions arise again and again? Because exceptions tell you something important. Usually, that the structure itself needs attention. Starting Monday, begin changing how compensation is discussed internally. Not as an HR initiative, not as a finance constraint, but as a business strategy, whether you are in a for-profit company or a not-for-profit organization, because that's what it is. So here's where we land. Compensation isn't human resources versus finance. It's HR and finance, because compensation sits at the center of people strategy, financial strategy, organizational trust, and business performance. And when HR and finance aren't aligned, employees feel it, managers feel it, the organization feels it. If this is something you're working through or something that feels familiar, you're not alone. We see this tension in organizations every single day, especially when compensation decisions are happening quickly without shared structure. And if this is something you're working through or something that's starting to show up in your organization, reach out and mention the episode. We genuinely love to hear what you're seeing and where things are getting stuck. And if it's helpful, we're always happy to share what we're seeing and what's actually working. Thanks for listening to What the Comp. If this made you think, please send it to someone who's navigating this same challenge. Because if human resources and finance are operating under different strategies, your compensation system will too. And before we close our episode today, I'd like to give a special thanks to my executive producers joining me, Sandra Carver, representing the human resources voice, and Chad Hoover, representing the voice of finance. This is What the Comp.